So while we are waiting for more participants to join in, I have our Analytics Club link in QR code and also the link on the screen. So in case you haven't joined in our club, please also follow us for the updates. Then you could keep track on our latest event. Okay, I think we could start now. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you and welcome to our second webinar of this semester. I'm Wayne, the president of Analytic Club and also the moderator of today. Before I jump to start, please note this session is being recorded and we have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so you have a chance to ask your question in mind. So let's begin. Okay, as you know, our topic today is storytelling with data. As analysts, we are not purely analyzing data, and we also have to share our findings to others in order to make our insight useful. Today, we are glad to have Ms. Emma Warrillow as our guest, who is the current SVP of Research and Data Insight Shift Paradigm. She leads a team of strategic analytics and research professionals with a passion for solving complex problems in marketing and helping clients understand their customers. Before the acquisition of her company, Shift Paradigm in 2021, Emma was the founder and also the president of Data Insight Group, a well-respected Toronto-based consultancy. Emma has close to 30 years experience in helping organizations to drive business results. Her work has spanned a variety of industry involving B2C, B2B, and also including those who market to intermediates like brokers. Her passion is making data make sense and helping decision makers get a value from data they collect. So, being a recognized expert in her field, today she is going to share with us one of the skills that we use frequently in data analytics industry, that is storytelling. So let's welcome her in. Welcome, Emma, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much. All right, let me just start sharing and then we'll get chatting. Everybody can see that? Great. Thanks so much for the introduction and for having me here today. I thought perhaps as I start, I'll give you a brief introduction as to who Shift Paradigm is, as we're a relatively new name in the Canadian marketplace. As we mentioned, we were formed about a year ago as a strategic merger of three companies. One was an organization called Trendline Interactive, who is well respected for email production and consulting. One was the company Data Insight Group that I founded 20 years ago, which was a data and analytics consultancy. And the final group was called LeadMD, which was known for marketing technology and revenue acceleration strategy. And overall, as an organization, we're based we have head offices in Scottsdale, Arizona, in Austin, Texas, and here in Guelph in Ontario. And our mission is to help sales and marketing teams work together through solutions rooted at the intersection of data, insights, people, process, customer engagement, and technology. So that's enough about that. Let's get into storytelling. So it might seem funny that we're discussing storytelling at an analytics club. But of course, we all know, and as Wing has already mentioned, we know that analytics storytelling is a key part of analytics, and that analytics is fundamental to data-driven storytelling and to data-driven decisions. And organizations that use data to make decisions are among the most successful. What do I mean by that? Let's think about a few organizations we know that are very successful with data. Google, of course, is one of always our most well-known organization when it comes to thinking about data and success with data. And Google uses data at the heart of so much of what they do. But one example of how they've used data more recently is to determine their manager training programs. They mined data from 10,000 performance reviews to identify the common behaviors of high-performing managers, and they created training programs to develop these competencies. So by using data, they made new decisions around how they were going to do their training, and these efforts boosted their median favorability scores for their managers from 83% to 88%. Disney also uses vast amounts of data across their organization to make decisions. One in particular is the data that's collected through their Magic Band program. The Magic Bands are bracelets that are worn by any visitor to a Disney park. They are your ticket, they're your hotel room key, they can be your credit card, and they collect data throughout your entire visit to the park through RDIF technology. Disney has been using this data as a way to improve customer experience and improve park logistics throughout their lifetime of these Magic Bands. The data, for example, might reveal that a set of customers is waiting in line for a ride, that there's a lot of people in one area of the park. And they can actually do things as in as real time as sending out a parade to the middle of the park to encourage people to leave that area and to move to another area of the park that is less busy. An incredible number of decisions are made all the time using this data. And, I can't think of another example of where impromptu crowds are dispersed through parades, but that's Disney for you. And finally, a bit closer to home, Loblaws, of course, is another organization that uses data to drive decisions. Their PC Plus program is one that is, focused exclusively on giving customers offers. Early on in the development of that program, they determined that they were going to use store data to make these offers, but they really thought that they would be able to do it at the segment level. They had come up with some customer segments, and they thought they'd be able to drive their program entirely at the segment level. But by looking at the data from shopper behavior, they realized that even when customers were in the same customer segments and appeared very similar in so many ways, the specific products that they bought and the specific way they purchased was different. And therefore, they determined that they needed to create a program that was actually much more customized to the individual customer rather than the segment. So all of these organizations are using data to significantly improve their decision-making. Yet why is it that the majority of decision makers still make their decisions based on their gut? Why do they not use data to make decisions? And there's lots of reasons. Many of those things are to do with trust, whether they trust that the data is right, whether they trust the data is clean enough, whether it's complete enough, whether the data is connected enough. Some of it's to do with skills, whether the decision makers themselves have enough data literacy to understand how to use the data, and whether the analysts that work for them have enough analytic abilities to generate the insights that they need to make decisions. And of course, the old problem of we've always done it that way, the cultural resistance that exists often with making decisions a different way. But fundamentally, as we think about using data to drive decisions, and we think about why people do or don't use that information, there's no question that what's critically important is that a decision maker has access to the information and can understand the information. And that's where storytelling comes in. I'm going to tell you a little story to start off the discussion on storytelling specifically. In their book, Made to Stick, Dan and Chip Heath tell a story of an experiment that Chip ran in his class at Stanford. What he does is at Stanford, he asks his students, each student in the class, to give a 1-minute persuasive speech, and after which he asks the students to rate the speaker's delivery. He then distracts all the students with a short video clip showing them something about something else. And so they've all kind of assumed that the presentation piece is over. But then after he's given the video, he turns to the class and asks each student to write down everything that they can remember about each speaker's presentation. Now, remember, their video was only a few minutes long. And so for the most part, all of these speeches they've heard in the last 10 to 15 minutes. Yet the students are absolutely flabbergasted every time he runs this experiment with how little they can remember. Despite only a few minutes having elapsed between the speeches and the writing it down, very often they can remember very, very little at all. In fact, they're usually lucky to remember 1 or 2 ideas from each presentation. Some of them, they were completely blank about what that person talked about. So when Chip and Dan analyzed this information, this is what they noticed. Sorry, let's move this slide. There it is. That when people are speaking, on average, each of the speakers use 2.5 statistics. So most of them use numbers. They use the statistics of information. Only 1 out of 10 students told a story. Yet when it comes to what they remember, 63% of students remember the stories, and only 5% remembered any individual statistic. 63% remember the story, only 5% remember the statistic. And that is really the biggest finding out of this work, and the reason that storytelling has become such an important part of the conversation is because it's stories that people remember. It's not individual pieces of data. And so whenever we're doing analytics, no matter how good we are at analytics, we really do need to make sure that what we're leaving behind is something people can remember. So I like to say that stories have the power to help people remember and to understand, and they have the power to bring data to life. So let's talk about what makes a good story. We all remember childhood classics like Cinderella, probably, or perhaps you have a similar story from your own childhood. But most of these stories have a very similar format. And so when you think about a story and you think about storytelling, think about the three distinct parts. We typically talk about a story has a setup. So the setup for Cinderella might be once upon a time, there was a lovely young lady who was living with her horrible stepmother and the terrible stepsisters, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the setup for your story. It communicates to everybody, the characters, the setting, and the main situation. And then we have what we call the buildup. And so the buildup is all about building towards an ending. So in Cinderella's case, Cinderella they met the fairy godmother. She got a chance to go to the ball. She got to dance with the prince. She had to run out at midnight and lost her shoe. All of these are part of the buildup to the story. And then the final part of the story is always the payoff. So the payoff is the conclusion. So the prince finally found his princess after searching far and wide, and they live happily ever after. And that's a story, a fairy tale story. It doesn't sound like it's got a lot to do with data, but it really is important to understand that the same format applies even when you're talking about data. So let's think of an example of this, okay? We might have, in this case, a problem where we say, we have recently noticed an issue with customer churn on our database. So we're noticing that people are not renewing their products with us, and we want to find out the causes. So that's the setup. The setup's telling us what's it all about. That's what it's all about. The buildup might be, well, initially we considered that our customers were aging out. But in fact, when we looked at the different age cohorts, we realized that churn was happening across all the age cohorts. So it wasn't to do with age that we're having high churn. Then we looked at our original customer source for customers who churned. And we noticed that a higher number of those who came from the online channel were churning. And so we looked deeper into that, and we found out that one of our specific offers was having incredibly high defection rates. And so now we built up the story. So now we started with, what is the setting? We've built up the story through some key avenues that we explored. It's the descriptions of different avenues that we explored, all of which are helping us get to the conclusion, which is we recommend that we remove the online 2-for-1 deal, because these customers cost us more to service than they bring in, and they churn at more than 90% of them churn after 1 year. And so that's the ending. So we give them a setup, we build through, and we end up with the payoff. There's a number of different things to remember about this story, but the important thing is that the recommended course of action is your payoff, but that the various build-up elements must lead towards the payoff. They either lead there directly because they tell you the story of how you got to the final answer, or they lead there by blocking off another answer. So we examined the age cohorts first, and we realized that wasn't the answer. So we took another turn and looked at something else. So we have to build to the story, and each of the places of the story should help us build where we're needing to get to. When I was younger, there's a picture here of a lady at the top of the stairs. And when I was young, my mother often used to get to the top of the stairs and call down to me, "Emma, why did I come up here?" As somebody who's now a little bit older myself, I'm starting to understand my mother more. But the important thing is that as we think about storytelling with data, one of the most important things that we have to remember is why we came. Why did we go up those stairs? Why did we head out this there? It's very easy for us to get excited by all the interesting nuggets that we can find in data. And it's very often that analysts get all excited about a whole lot of different avenues they've explored. But the key to making sure that there's a story involved, the key to making sure that the storytelling in your presentation is relevant, is not forgetting why you came, not forgetting what it was that was driving the initial conversation, because otherwise your audience will lose sight of why you came as well, if you lose sight of it as well. Unfortunately, however, when it comes to presentations by analysts, we do tend to forget where we came. We tend to get really excited by all the analysis we can do and all the cool charts we can make. I don't know if anyone's ever made a sand key diagram, for example, and while those findings are important, it's not always necessary to tell a story. Someone gave me this expression the other day, the MEGO, and it stands for my eyes glaze over. And it's a pretty common reaction that people have to analytic presentations, unfortunately. And being a long-time analyst myself, I understand it. But one of the mistakes we often make as analysts is that you want your audience to know how much work you did, but actually the audience doesn't care. The audience just wants you to get them through the story so that they can get you to the end. They don't actually care how much work you did. And so often that means leaving some of that great work on the table in order to tell the story most effectively. Sad though that may be. So as you think about writing the story, you've done your analysis, you've found some insights, and now you want to write the story. Before you start thinking about what the setup is, and what the buildup is, and what the conclusion is going to be, you got to identify 4 things. And the first thing you want to identify is, who is your message for? What is the audience for this message? Is it the prof that asked you to do this assignment? Is it a business owner who you're doing a co-op program with? Is it the head of the marketing department who you're working very closely with on a campaign? Who is it? Who is the audience of your message? Because who that audience is will make a big difference in how you tell the story. What are the key takeaways you want someone to remember? What is that message? What is it you're hoping that they get out of this presentation? I like the next one. How do you want them to feel? Do you want them to feel excited? Do you want them to feel worried? Do you want them to just feel confident that you've got this and they don't have to worry? Think about what you want them to feel, because that also is very important as you drive what needs to be in your story. And then the final thing, of course, is what do you want them to do? What is the call to action? What is it you want them to do as a result of this presentation? And if you keep those 4 things in mind as you build that story, you're going to have the right content to create a compelling story. Let me give you an example. This is some data in a number of spreadsheets that came from in March of 2020. So the Imperial College of London did, along with the WHO and the global infectious disease scientists, did an extensive country by country look at the predicted impacts of COVID with and without various mitigation strategies, masking and lockdowns, et cetera. They gathered data and generated predictions under a variety of scenarios, and the output was contained in this large Excel sheet. The initial work that they did was published in Science magazine. And perhaps for a scientific audience, these visuals are helpful and useful, but truthfully, even as someone who makes their living with data, I find them a bit confusing. Fortunately, they were coupled with a 10-page paper. But truthfully, when I look at this, my eyes glaze over a little bit. But the 10-page paper does illuminate the story. And for those people that were interested in the full story, the paper was probably great. But the messages out of this work, or the most important things out of this work, needed to reach a larger audience. And when the CDC looked at the report, and the CDC wanted to build a story for a much broader audience, for an audience of you and I, and an audience of doctors and nurses and everybody working and living through COVID. So the CDC said, how do I build this data story in a very simple but effective way? And in fact, they wanted to build it simply with a visual story. They didn't even want to have a lot of words. They built a visual story. And their message was clear from their story. So let me share their story. This is their story. They took that messy, ugly data, and they built a very simple visual that told a very clear story. The audience being, the average North American. And the message was that without protective measures, we were going to exceed the capacity of our healthcare systems. What did they want people to feel? They wanted people to feel alarmed. What did they want us to do? They wanted us to stay home and put our masks on. And so very simply, through an image and through the use of color, through the use of a few key labels on their report or on their visual, they took what was a lot of really great data and a lot of really great information and made something very simple from it to tell their story. Because actually, we didn't need to know how many cases were on the left-hand axis. We didn't need to know the exact time across the bottom axis. All we needed to know was that red curve was much higher and hit much sooner than if we followed the messages from the gray curve. So through some very simple use of color, use of lines and direction, they were able to tell quite a simple and compelling message that actually had big impact. So great stories meet these three criteria. They're impactful. They're memorable. You want them to be, you want people to know what to tell people, right? So memorable, the story I just told you, memorable because it was flatten the curve. It was an expression everybody used, right? It was very memorable. And finally, the final part is it's personal. And I think this is the part sometimes we forget when we're talking about analytics and we're talking about storytelling for analytics. Personal is an important part of any story. As human beings, we look for stories about people. Even when we tell stories about animals, we tend to ascribe them with human characteristics. So we tend to think of the story as one that is related to humans. And so when I look at the tweet that accompanied this particular version of this CDC image, I think that Drew Harris here is one of many commentaries that really does make it personal. In a few short words, he drives home the difference. He drives the point home because he says in the last sentence here, it's the difference between finding an ICU bed and a ventilator or being treated in the parking lot tent. And very quickly, through that simple line, he takes this image and makes it human. He makes us think about our grandparents and our parents or ourselves, and the fact that we want them to be inside the hospital, tucked away in a proper place to be taken care of by doctors and nurses, not being stuck in some scene out of Grey's Anatomy when everybody's running around in the parking lot because there's been an accident. And so storytelling, when done right, even when it's about data, can be very human as well. So I'm going to give you a couple of guidelines, if you like, for telling a story through through the visualization of a story. Because often with analytics, that's what we're trying to do. We know how to tell the story, perhaps in a, I've talked about the Cinderella story. We know how to do those parts, but sometimes we forget, how do we create something like this CDC image here? How do we create something like that? How do we make our stories have more of the appropriate visual look? And so there's sort of three key areas that I like to talk about when I think about this. The first is eliminating clutter. Very often, when you think about some of those examples I gave earlier, the messy ones from Science Magazine, or the ones where I talked about my eyes glazing over, very often our visuals are very cluttered. So the questions I might ask myself, if I was you and I was trying to create a better visual, is there anything in my diagram that's actually not adding any value? Are there any unnecessary elements that I could remove? Am I using white space effectively? Have I got just so many colors and so many fonts that people aren't going to be able to understand it? The second piece of advice I'd say is draw attention where you want it drawn. Think about where you want your audience to focus, and use position, use color, use arrows, use whatever it might be that draws people's eyes to the right place, the thing you really want them to notice. So if it is that you want people to notice a specific area of your spreadsheet, even, maybe you highlight that area. Maybe that's the piece you highlight, but think about how to draw the audience to the place that you want it. And finally, make sure that your image and your visualization is appropriately labeled and annotated. Sometimes that means a lot of detail, depending what it is you're trying to convey. Sometimes that means little, but make sure you're being clear about what is the conclusion, clear about, are things labeled the way they need to be? Can somebody truly understand it? So I'm going to walk you through now an example of how we might attack a problem like that through here. And that I just wanted to give you a simple example. So this is a really ugly one. Think about this one. This is a diagram of social media platform usage by age. And someone actually gave me this lovely chart. And as you can see, it's busy. It's got a lot of color. It's got a lot of things. It's pretty hard to take in. And it feels a little bit hard to even decide what it's really saying, what it's really about. So we think about doing a few things. First thing is, let's take away some of the complex background of font. So let's go from this multicolored, funny looking thing to something simpler. We've taken off some of the lines, we made it a little simpler, but let's make it even better. We can do more than this. Let's get rid of the 3D. If I can give you one piece of advice, don't use 3D in your visuals. They might seem cool. They're hard to read. They don't typically look good. 3D is great for drawings. It's not so great for visuals. So here we've taken off some of the lines. We've taken off the 3D. Suddenly it's looking a little easier to understand and follow, but I think we can still make it better. We've taken off the, in this case, much like we did with the CDC one, we've removed the y-axis. And why do we do that? Well, we've already put on this diagram, we already have for every bar is already labeled. So having the axis, there's really not adding any more value. It feels a bit redundant. So we've taken that off and made it look a little easier to understand. But then even cleaned it up even further. We made the x-axis, instead of being horizontal, instead of being vertical, they're horizontal, so they're easier to read. We've moved the numbers into the bars, so they're a little easier to read. They don't feel like extra clutter on top. And suddenly now it's a lot more straightforward to read this chart and to understand it. We've changed it though. The first chart here said social media platform usage by age. We're now saying let's clean that up a bit. Let's actually tell people what we want people to see. And what we're actually telling somebody, the story here is actually that young adults are the largest users of social media platforms as a whole, because the orange bar is the young adults, and that Instagram is the most popular of those. Those are some easy takeaways, as opposed to just social media platform producers. We want to know what we want to tell them. We want to tell them that. We want to tell them young adults, far the most common, and the Instagram is the most popular. And in fact, if we really want to tell them, we might even clean this up even more and just highlight the young adults. Right? Because that's really what we're trying to ask the person to look at. So if we're talking about driving them to the specific finding, well, the specific finding here is that young adults are the most, is what we really want people to focus on. So let's highlight the young adults. We've still got different colors for the other bars so that if people need to understand which is which, they can. But we've drawn everybody's eyes directly to the one we're most interested in talking to them about, and the conclusion of the story we want to tell them. Okay. Just thought I'd give you a real life example. So I'm going to finish with a couple of quotes. So the first one is that if I had, Isaac Einstein has been known to say this, or was being quoted to say this. I don't know if it's true or not, but I like the quote. So I'm going to assume it really was Einstein. This is a great quote about analytics. If I only had 1 hour to save the world, I would spend 55 minutes defining the questions and only 5 minutes finding answers. And I would 100% tell you that as an analyst, this is a great piece of advice. It is the one we least likely to follow, but a great piece of advice. And now I've added my own piece of advice to the end, and I'd spend the next hour figuring out how to tell everybody what I found out. So spend the time asking the right question and spend the time telling the story, not all the time on the analysis. The analysis is really important, but so are those other two pieces. And I will say one thing, that when you're working on analytics, this is an important message as well, is that it is really important to make sure you leave time to tell the story. What happens very often, and I am sure any one of you who does any work in analytics today probably has done, I've got an assignment due in, tomorrow, or I've got this done. Most of us are up all night getting the assignment done. And by the time it comes to the presentation, we're just like, stick this stuff in here and okay, off we go. Again, I recognize that's sometimes the reality of what we have, but as we start to think about how to plan our time for our work, this is something you should plan time in for, is to tell the story, especially if you've got to present it to into an audience, and particularly if it's a non-analytic audience. They really need you to take the time to understand the story. And I'll leave you with the final quote, which is that facts don't persuade, feelings do. And stories are the best way to get at those feelings. And now I'll turn it over to any questions.
Thank you, Emma, for the wonderful keynote. And also those practical examples help us to understand better how to really turn those theories into practical in the real reality world. And now our executive, Ahmed, will take care of the Q&A session. If you have any question, please feel free to unmute yourself. Or if you are not audible, then you could put in the chat. Yeah, I see some hands up. Sean, yeah, please go ahead.
Hello, Ms. Warrillow. Thank you very much for being here and sharing your experience. That's a lot of experience that you have. So I appreciate that. My concern is I like Albert Einstein's quote, and he also said that if you can explain it to a 6 years old, you're doing a pretty good job.
That's right.
And I try. Unfortunately, nowadays, we seem to be pretty impressed with a lot of data. So I seem to be in a minority in terms of trying to simplify my message. And it seemed people seem to be okay. If you put a lot of data on the screen, you're kind of showing that you had done a lot of work. And as a student, that basically that is going to be, if I try to present my story in a simple way and try to get the message in a simple way, that is a disadvantage for me. I understand that in the world, it's a better approach. However, as a student, it's a disadvantage because basically I'm spending a lot of time cleaning up the data, trying to get it presented in a format that accessible. But as a student, it's a disadvantage. And I also find that to tell the story in a simpler way, you have to be exposed to the cultures. And again, there's so many different, in Toronto, we are very diverse, and it's really difficult to kind of affect the message to the audience. So again, I struggle a lot. And I don't know, maybe there's a light at the end of the tunnel that if I keep it going, I'll be there. But I'm afraid that some of us might fall off before we actually get it. So I don't know, maybe you can offer some suggestion as to how to survive this.
Great. Two great points you made there. So first of all, I totally understand that as a student, often you're being asked to give all the information, and the idea of simplifying it or making it, making it seem like you haven't done as much work isn't always in your favor. I would suggest that as you think about putting that story together, as you think about making it more simple and giving the simple version, I think as a student, I would suggest it's probably not a bad idea to put some of your work in your appendix, put some of your work so that whoever it is that's evaluating you and you're worried that is going to think you didn't do the work, make sure that work is there, make sure the work's available to anyone who wants to look at it. But I still highly recommend you still think about how do I make sure that I am drawing out insights and telling stories in addition to having all that extra information there. And I recognize that often your teachers will need to see the details of what you've done, and so you want to make sure that's there. But I find it hard to believe that none of them would be impressed by your ability to simplify it into something that is clear and insightful. And so, but I think that's how I might handle that as a student. I think your other questions are really important one, or your other comment is a really important one about culture. And I think that part of the reason that I suggest of looking at the audience is exactly that, because we do have to figure out what our audience is. And truthfully, I don't know this audience. And I gave an example with some COVID examples, and I gave an example with Cinderella, neither of which may have been appropriate for this audience. And that's a question that, I don't know the answer to yet. And I think as you look at the cultures in your audience, that is important. I think what I might do if I was working in that environment, as you've talked about, is look for what are the commonalities in the audience. If my audience is this analytics club, then I might, as I'm planning my presentation, I might think about what is it that I know are commonalities here. Well, we're all students of George Brown. We're all have some knowledge of Toronto, perhaps because we're connected to George Brown, even though some of us may not have visited Toronto yet, but are on our way. So I might look for examples in the environment or in the culture that is dominant there, because you're absolutely right that stories can fall flat on their face if you are making references that people don't understand or don't have exposure to themselves. So I think it's a great point.
There's a person in the chat had a question, Luciana. They're asking any tips for reducing our personal experiences, influences when building a story, and how to minimize them, make it less biased analysis.
Good question. I think there's two things about that. I think in some ways it's okay if your story has some personal influence. If you're thinking about it, how can I understand this from a personal point of view? As long as you're also asking, is it just as long as you continue to ask yourself, am I sure that I'm not being biased in this. So one example I'll give is I've done a lot of work in my career in predictive modeling. And so often with predictive modeling, you're coming up with a set of variables that predicts behavior. And my work has mostly been in marketing. So I'm usually predicting customer behavior. And it is very easy to ascribe, when I look and see what are the characteristics of a customer who does X or Y, it's very easy for me to think about myself in that. And you're right that we want to be careful not to just think about ourselves, but it is important to think about the personal side. And in fact, if it doesn't make sense to you personally, then sometimes it actually doesn't make sense, and you need to figure that out. So I think that it's okay to have to put your personal hat on, as long as you continue to look outside it and say, what other point of view do I need to have? In terms of bias and analysis, I think that is one thing that comes up sometimes in the conversations about storytelling that I think is very important. I think that storytelling is about, is about getting the answers from the data, but there's no question. All of us know that if what is it? Somebody said once about torturing the data enough, you'll get the answers you want. We do have to be thoughtful and make sure we really are being true to what we're asking for. So when I say that we want to be true to what we came for, and we've talked about this idea that, why did I come upstairs? It is important that you are truly answering that question, not that you are pushing the data towards one answer, and that can be difficult. So someone asked me the other day about sort of what was a time that I found that it's very hard to tell a story with data, and I will tell you a little story that kind of relates to this. And then many years ago, I was working in a bank, and the bank had come up with a new strategy. And instead of sending people marketing messages that were very direct, like, do you need a mortgage or do you need a credit card? They wanted to send what they were calling relationship messages. So more like, oh, we really love you as a bank customer. We want you to be our customer forever. Thanks for being a customer, those kind of messages. And so they had sent out a campaign, and the way they traditionally measured campaigns was how many products people bought. And so the analysis we'd done was to look and see how well this campaign had done when you looked at how many products people had bought, and then 2 weeks following the campaign. Well, not surprisingly, a campaign that was, hey, we like you as a customer, didn't have quite the same number of people buying products as one that said, buy this product. It's easier to know what to do if you get to buy this product. So I was asked by my boss to put together the results to present to her boss. And it was a very difficult conversation, because I was presenting the results that said that this didn't work very well. And, part of the story was that, part of the story had to be this sort of concept of, well, and it didn't work very well when compared to the current way of measuring campaigns. But part of the story was also, we really need to come back and tell you a little bit about it after 6 months, because we know this is going to be a longer term thing than an immediate 2-week response. And so maybe over time this will work. So we had to figure out how to tell that story to the boss. And I felt pretty good about the story I put together, but my boss was not as truthful about it, and so ended up doing something that was a little bit biased in that she found the one group that had done very well. So one of the segments in the customer base had really liked this message and already had strong relationships with their bank, and so they've sort of felt they felt for whatever reason they were quite responsive, and so this particular group, which was a very small group of customers, had done very well. And so my boss sort of turned the story around to be all about that group, and so her message was all about how wonderfully this group had done. And because she'd lost the larger message, her boss turned around and said, okay, great. So since this campaign worked so well, we're going to roll it out next year. We're going to do it for everybody. We're not going to, and we hadn't been able to conclude that it hadn't worked very well in most of the camps. So you do have to be careful. You don't give just the answer you think people want to hear. You do have to be true to what's there. So I'm not sure I answered that totally, Luciana, but that's the long answer.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. Thank you very much for your presentation. You mentioned at the beginning the framework set up conflict resolution. Like in multiple times, like looking through more information about presentation, that's the main framework that I heard. In your opinion, that's the only one that you can use to present, and like that's the one that it follows? Because this is used like in Hollywood and everywhere else, but like this is the only way to have the framework to present?
Sorry, with the framework I used, the introduction, the build up, and
yes, the setup, conflict, and resolution.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it looks a little different than that, but I think in the end, you do need all those parts to your story. One of the things I recommend is if you have a lot of what they call inciting accident incidents through the buildup, if you have a lot of those buildup pieces, one of the things I recommend is connecting the story throughout. So often you use connecting words, like you might say, first we looked at this, and because that didn't work well, then and move to the next, we looked at this, and because we learned this, then we did this, so that you help people, walk people through the story, so those connections help. But generally, I do see that is usually the approach, is that you start with some kind of setup to make sure you're building clarity around what the story is. And again, it depends what you're trying to present, but typically if you're trying to present data, you are typically trying to build to one conclusion. I think one of the challenges we have sometimes is that we have a lot of conclusions, or we have a lot of stories we want to tell throughout a presentation. And that's okay, but typically, so you might find there's a story within a story. Right, you might find you have another setup, but another within the larger story. I think sometimes the hard part is figuring out the big story. So sometimes you've got all these little stories, and you've got to figure out what's the unifying conversation here. What are we really trying to get people to understand from these individual stories? So I think sometimes that format is also part of it. Is a story within a story. Do you have a different format that you like for story?
Like, you ask me if I have?
Yeah. Sure.
No, that's the only one. That's like the hero journey, right? That's like in Star Wars, or like even in Jesus Christ's story, like the guy who started from nothing and have like a conflict. Well, and then there's the resolution, and then applying these to business presentations is very handy. And that's what I ask you. Like, if there's another alternative, or we could just focus on that as like a base and a framework to make presentations.
Yeah, no, I think it's certainly a common story, and the reason it exists in so many cultures and for so many years is because it is a compelling way that humans understand stories.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I actually have one question. So, as we saw in the previous example, that eliminating the data and how you present it, the eliminating clutters. So if in the real world we are working in a team and we have a specific audience, we all the team members are aligned with the type of audience that we are dealing with, but every team member has a different perspective. So how to have a common base when it comes to cluttering the data, because we are dealing in the big data world. So how to
That's
get the
question.
team
I mean,
in a...
Yeah, you're absolutely right that what is cluttered to one person might look nice to another person. Like that is something that you always need to work through. I think if the best way I can describe it is continue to ask yourself, does this help the story? So does adding this color here help the story? Does having this in 3D help the story? Like, continue to ask yourself and your teammates, what reason do we have to do this? Is it really helping the story? And for sure, everybody's got different ideas about what font looks nice, or what, and most of those things are, sometimes we just have to compromise and let someone else use the font they like. Most of those things don't matter that much. I think the key is anything we're adding to this chart or anything that's here helping us tell the story, or is it detracting? And if it's truly detracting, then I think it's worth, arguing with your teammates about. But I think if it is something that's just, you like green and they like blue, whatever, it's probably fine. So it's I think just continue to ask that. And all of these things, like everything, are very much subjective. You even might ask yourself, what do I know about the audience? So if you were presenting to somebody specific, like if you're presenting to, there are audiences, for example, that actually do want all those detailed numbers on the side of the bar. Like, so you do have to know a little bit about your audience. So as much as I can say, simplify, in some audiences, they want that complexity, and that's how they are, and that's how they behave. And so you do need to sort of have a bit of a sense as to who the people are that you're presenting to and what they typically like. I have one client who loves details. They love the numbers and the really detailed numbers. It's not enough for them to know this is bigger than this, like that orange and gray chart. That wouldn't be enough for them. They'd want to know exactly what percentage this was, exactly what this was, exactly how much time is on the chart, and all those things. And so you do have to understand who your audience is. But in the case of, often if you're thinking about so in that case, that audience, they may also have a different agenda, and you need maybe a different message you need from them, or that you need to get to them, and so you may have to present it a slightly different way. But yeah, teamwork is always difficult, but it's important because you always get teams in business.
Yes, it's important. That's right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the
problem.
answer.
I actually had a question myself.
Okay.
Like, what are the essential, like, hard skills do you think are, or knowledge areas do you think are important for like success in marketing analysis or data insights? Like the important
Good
ones.
question. I think, some of the hard skills are, certainly programming skills, data visualization skills, whether that's, programming. I'd say you need SQL. I say nowadays it's probably good to have Python skills. And so there are some sort of, hard skills like that are important. But I actually think in many ways, the soft skills are more important. We can learn those hard skills from, online and learn them, whenever we want. But some of the softer skills that I think are important, storytelling is obviously one, but just generally communication skills are important. Curiosity is probably, for me, a fundamental skill of a good analyst. You have to be curious. You have to want to figure out the answer, and you want to dig deeper and figure things out. Obviously, logic and those kinds of things are important, but I do think some of the soft skills sometimes get overlooked. We sometimes spend all our time building hard skills around, software coding and things like that, which are super important. But we also need to work on our soft skills to make sure that we are able to communicate the right ideas, able to dig in the right directions, and get where we want to get to. And I think curiosity is one of those. If I had to pick one, I'd probably pick that one as a really important one.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, maybe one other question that I would like to know, what is the game changer that led you towards the to enter the career in analytics field? I share with us.
So I always was a fan of math, like all the way through school. I loved solving problems and I love math. And so I went to do my undergrad in math and stats, and ended up doing my second degree was in something called management sciences, which was a combination of math and business. And it was actually in the industrial engineering department, but it's a long time ago. But for me, I always knew I wanted to do something using my math, but I didn't really know what that was. And I thought I might want to be an actuary. And I thought I didn't know what I wanted. And I admit that I stumbled a little bit into this career through a connection. My father, if you believe it, was at dinner with somebody, and they were talking, and this guy was saying, "Oh, I really have a hard time hiring people who have statistics backgrounds." So my father came home from this dinner and said, "Oh, if only you'd studied statistics." And I said, "What do you think I studied in my math and stats degree?" I said, "I did study statistics." And so he says, "Oh, you should go talk to these guys." And so I went and talked to them. I got a summer job there. And so I really got my first exposure to this field in a summer job, where we were working with credit card companies, helping them figure out which customers were most likely to get, which of the bank's customers are most likely to get a credit card. And I realized that quite quickly that I was getting a chance to work with data, work with analytics, but also work in a field that I personally found kind of interesting, which was the marketing side of it. There was a little more interest than for me than doing analytics for something else. And so I've always liked the way that marketing analytics allows me to combine my kind of people skills and people, interest in understanding about behavioral psychology and those kinds of things with math. So that was kind of how I stumbled in. I don't know if it was a game changer or not, but it was a dinner my dad was at.
Yep. Thank you for sharing. And any other questions?
I have a question for you guys. What are the other topics you're going to be talking about in your analytics club? What are your other keynotes been about?
Yeah, for our keynote, the last session is from Mr. Diba, who is the director from TELUS. He shared that his journey, what leads him to the analytic field.
Excellent. Great.
Yeah.
What else would you like to know about? How about anybody got any topics that they'd like to know about? Maybe I can suggest a speaker.
Pardon me? What?
Anybody
was
like
that?
do you have any topics that you think you'd love to hear a speaker talk about something in your analyst club?
That's a great opportunity straight away coming across. I feel someone who doesn't has a background of science, analytics, and getting to know more of how the base of like the initial career phase of an data analyst is, talking more about their journey would be a great help for a motivator for the new beginners who are entering into the data analytics world.
If I may, I have another question.
Okay.
Emma, with like this wave of layoffs in tech nowadays, how do we feel the analytics, the new entry analytics could fit in for like this, like hiring, like this new style of hiring?
I think it's a great question. I think there have been a lot of layoffs across the industry and across all sorts of fields. And I still believe that there is a lot of opportunity in this space. I certainly see that every day in my dealings and with my clients. They're always looking for strong analytic skills. So I think in many ways, I think the analytics is going to be still a very sought after career for some time. And then I think I understand your question right, I think there's also an opportunity for perhaps us to use data to help as we think about hiring and as we think about what areas of our organizations we should hang on to. I suspect there's some opportunities for some analysis in the HR field around resumes we're seeing, around what makes a successful hire, how long it takes to find a new person in the field. I think it could be very interesting to look and see how analytics stacks up to other areas of an organization. And so I think there are certainly people in the HR field who are using analytics to improve their hiring and to figure out where those layoffs should happen and shouldn't happen. So I think that's another area you might see.
Thank you.
Okay, is there any further questions?
Hi, Emma. I would like to ask one more question. Is there any success mantra or advice that you would like to share with potential analytics candidates, like in the job interview, to show your skills of storytelling or data visualizations? Like you can show a project while you are doing the interview. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think no matter what, I think showing that you are somebody who is, I mentioned curiosity, and I still believe that. So I think somebody who is, showing the interviewer that you are somebody who is very curious, that you have, you want to understand, but also that you're someone who is always learning. Because I think that anyone in this field in the next 10 years will need to be always learning. If I look back at my career, everything I started doing is different today than it was. And certainly in the last 5 to 10 years, it's accelerated unbelievably in terms of even the tools I'm using are different, but the techniques are the same, or the principles are the same. And so while now we might be using different software, we're using much faster, different kinds of data. We've got a lot more data. We've got a lot different ways of doing the work. Some of the fundamental principles stay. So I think showing that you're somebody who can keep learning and is interested in learning new things is going to be important. I think in terms of what you can show an employer, I have noticed a trend recently, which is that I've had a number of resumes where somebody has attached a link to a website where they have put some examples of some of the work that they've done on it. And I do go to that whenever I get one of those resumes. I do find myself going there. So if you've got some great examples of some visualizations you've done, or some great examples of some storytelling that you want to share, don't be shy to put that on your resume. It doesn't hurt. As I said, not everyone's going to go there, but I know I myself find I'm curious and I will go. And it really does give a very good indication of what someone can do in comparison to what the resume might just say. Resumes, everybody says, I've got some Python, I've got some Tableau, I've got, everybody's got a list of the things they've done, and a lot of them sound exactly the same. But until when you get to see an example of it, it is often will make the difference. You go, okay, this person really knows how to do some interesting stuff here. They've done some some interesting kinds of projects. So, and even if it's stuff you've done in your spare time just for fun, I think that sharing with somebody some of those things is a really valuable thing. And by putting it onto a wiki or onto something, it makes it easy, for you to share to multiple people, but there's an opportunity to share some of the things you've done on their time when they have time for you.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, and we are approaching the end of the webinar. I hope you don't mind that we are going to answer the very last question that I see in the chat. That is there any material you recommend for people without a data or mathematics background, in this particular case, in the risk management field?
Oh, it depends what you want to learn. It's a big question. I think there's so many, there's so many different things about analytics you might want to learn. I think there are a lot of great books out there right now about analytics, and I'm drawing a blank a bit, but there's a lot of good kind of approachable books like what's it called? There's a predictive. It'll come to me in a second. I'll think about that book. But as far as storytelling goes, I highly recommend a book called Storytelling with Data. It is a book that has been out for a few years now, and I think it has a companion book now called the Storytelling with Data Workbook or something. The woman's name is Cole Nussbaumer, I think, and she was a former analyst from Amazon, I think. Anyway, fantastic book. It's very simple to understand, but it has a lot of the principles we just talked about around decluttering your visualization, things like that. Definitely recommend that. She also has a great blog, which if you just go to her website, I think it's literally called storytellingwithdata.com. She has some great examples, and she's always just like posting, okay, here's an example of what I did to make this more interesting. So a great way to make it more manageable, so that, I think actually the storytelling is one of the places where people with less background in deep math and stats can really still shine, because there's lots of data out there that needs to be, stories to be told about, that are just plain spreadsheet data. There's not any, incredibly advanced math, but by telling the story that way. So that one I definitely recommend. Yes, and kids put it on the chat there. Highly recommend that book. But there are a few other books out there that are more sort of books in the social sciences, but do a good job of kind of telling you a little bit about how people are using data today. Because I think sometimes for people without a strong math and stats background, a lot of what is important is that you build your data literacy and your ability to understand how data might be applied. So you may never have to be the one that builds the model, but you want to understand when you need a model. And so that's where a lot of help can come. I will pass on to Wing a couple of examples of some books, and maybe she can pass it on to the club, because I'm drawing a blank at the names of the ones I'm thinking of right now, but other than Storytelling with Data.
Yeah, sure, no problem. After I got the material from you, then I will share it in our Analytics Cup LinkedIn account.
Okay.
And I think that's all the questions that we have from the participants. And once again, thank you, Amber, to be our guest speaker today and share all these valuable tips to us. And I believe not just me, and also the participant here today, that they got a very useful insight from your side, and they could practice more in their future. And thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, and good luck, everybody.
Thank you, and have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you.